Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Enchanting Lawyer Podcast. This is a show where we interview the most inspiring entrepreneurs and business people and creators from all over the world who share with us great ideas and inspire us to do our job better and stay motivated. Today, I have an interesting guest from all the way from South Africa. We have Rodney King here. And, what is interesting about Rodney's story, and we'll dive into it more, is, we all have struggles, we all have fears, and we all have things that we want to try to accomplish. And I think this is a remarkable story of a human being that accomplished something that nobody believed he could. Rodney introduces the best aspects of performance psychology to help people achieve their own goals. He's a martial arts specialist, and he combines the art of martial arts and the psychology and also techniques that we can use in business, and he does it in a very amazing way. He also has a book we're going to talk about. Rodney, I'm excited to have you here on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thanks for making the time.
Sure.
So, we have so many things to talk about, and I know that, one thing that, my listeners who are, typically professionals, people that work hard, and they kind of, focus on the 9 to 5 and trying to get their businesses up and running, whether they're attorneys or other professionals. But I know that, you have an interesting story where, you pretty much, you're sleeping in a park on a bench. Yep. And most people thought that you're not going to end up doing anything worth in your life, and you kind of have an amazing story. So why don't you kind of take us a little bit, tell us what you do now, and then take us back to the beginning.
Yeah, well, I think you summed it up. I kind of consider myself an inner management guru, if we can call it that, and I really work with inspiring entrepreneurs to help them achieve inner excellence. My story really began on the south side of Johannesburg. It's a really rough area in South Africa. It's government housing, right, very similar to the projects in the United States. So I grew up really poor. Typically in those kinds of environments, in those neighborhoods, gangs were rife. I had to deal with that kind of situation and the bullying at school. My mom was an alcoholic. I was brought up only by my mom, and I grew up never knowing my father. And at about the age of 17, drunken rage, she kicked me out of the house, and I found myself sleeping on a park bench, the very same park bench in the park that I played in as a kid. And there I was with less than $20 in my pocket, and it seemed that, I wasn't going to go anywhere, that there was going to be this self-fulfilling prophecy, because oftentimes when you see people coming out of really impoverished neighborhoods, it seems to become something that that's where their life begins and ends. And I could see, it seemed that way, that's what it was going to be for me. And somehow I was able to turn my life around. I didn't know it then, but in hindsight, I put it down to my martial arts training, and the inner game tools and the discipline that I achieved through martial arts training helped me transfer that over into my everyday life and help me become a success. And that's really what I teach today and what I work with my clients. I bring those lessons across, the very same lessons that I've used to become a successful entrepreneur, but also a martial artist.
So, back in your teens, you were already training in martial arts. What was your initial focus in life? You were somebody who was a trainer, or you were competing? Kind of, what was your career path in that field?
Yeah, it's quite diverse, actually, because, when I got kicked out of the house and I had nowhere to go, I slept on the streets for a little while, and then I decided that the only thing that seemed available to me was to go into military service. And at that time in South Africa, going to the military was compulsory anyway. You had to go to compulsory military service, but you only had to do it once you had finished school. I entered military before I was 18. And while I was in the military, because I'd already been training martial arts for many years before that, I was noticed by the command, and they put me in a position where I was given rank. I became a platoon sergeant, and I ultimately became the hand-to-hand combat instructor for my unit. And I was part of VIP Protection, which was the bodyguarding group of the South African Defence Force. I also served in counterinsurgents operations, which is the anti-terrorist group. Once I left the military, I had no prospects. I had no opportunity to get a job. Nobody would hire me. Sure, I had military skills,
Sure.
but I didn't have a high school diploma. So I went to Thailand, and I actually trained in Thailand in Muay Thai, which is the national sport of Thailand. I did that for almost a decade. And when I came back from Thailand, I couldn't find a job, and the only thing that I could find a job in was as a bouncer. And so for the next 7 years, I worked as a doorman outside some of the roughest nightclubs in Johannesburg, ultimately becoming the head doorman, and by the time I left, I had about 70 doormen working for me. Once I did that, and I finished that kind of cycle of my life, I went into full-time teaching, started developing a program that's now taught in 15 countries around the world. It's called Crazy Monkey Defense. I brought mixed martial arts to South Africa when nobody had ever heard about it, put on the first competitions. Obviously, if we go back a little bit just before that, when I was training in my formative stages of training, I competed in karate. I was also competing in Western boxing. So I went through the competitive cycle. So I did a lot of things to get to where I am now, but it's always been, I guess, within the realm of martial arts in some shape, way, or form.
And it seems to me that, having that focus, that that this is something that grounds you, the principles of martial arts, kind of looks like it helped you, in a way, navigate through life, even though you have very, very rough beginnings.
It did, absolutely. But what was kind of interesting for me was that I wasn't aware that it was helping me, if that made sense. It was just, I was going through life. I was like anybody. I was dealing with the chaos of life. Or when I discussed with my students, I talk about, taking on the martial arts of everyday life. That's what I was doing. And it's only now that I'm in my 40s, in hindsight, looking back, that I realized what actually, what was I actually using? What were those tools? And it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, Full Contact Living, which was really just a way of, helping everybody else understand these principles that I had discovered in my own journey, even though at the time I wasn't fully aware of it. And so what I try to do now when I'm coaching people, rather than allowing that to just happen by accident, I make it purposeful. Right. So I'm actually, showing them exactly what I did that enabled me to become a success. Had I known that previously and had somebody shown me, I probably would have become successful even sooner.
Right, but that's how life works, right? You never know.
It is.
Until you actually try it. So, talking about the book, and I find it very fascinating, the way you blend the martial arts principle with everyday things that we can do. And so the book is called Full Contact Living. And you break it down into 6 principles. So why don't we kind of run through them? I think the first one, you call it the wabi-sabi of performance.
That's right.
And so, why don't we talk about this one? What do you mean by that? The wabi-sabi of performance.
Well, wabi-sabi is a beautiful term. It's a Japanese term, and the Japanese look at things a little bit differently to a lot of other cultures. And in that sense, they look at the beauty and imperfection. That just because something isn't perfect doesn't make it beautiful. If we relate that back to life, and especially martial arts and as entrepreneurs, because I'm an entrepreneur as well, a lot of times that the entrepreneurs that I work with, they're always waiting for perfect to happen before they make a move. And the reality is that perfection is an illusion. If you're waiting for perfect, you're going to be waiting a very long time. So one of the things you have to learn to do is that even though everything isn't perfect as you would like it, you need to learn to move towards the goals that you've set yourself. Because as that notes, wabi-sabi is saying, well, there is a beauty in imperfection. I would argue that the fact that things aren't perfect is the very ingredients that you need in order to have that grit to move towards your goals. If everything was perfect, if everything was optimal, you probably wouldn't even want to achieve anything. You wouldn't strive. So by things not being perfect, it gives you that inner tenacity and that grit that you need in order to move towards your goals. Most people don't view it that way, right? So most people want everything to be perfect before they do anything. I'll give you a classic example of in my industry, somebody will come in, watch a class, they'll see what we do, they'll come to me afterwards and say, Rodney, I loved what I saw. But you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away and I'm going to get fit first. And once I'm fit, I'm going to come back and train with you. There's this idea of perfection, right? And normally what happens is they never, ever come back.
Right.
And so what
because
they should
they
have...
already set themselves for expectation that is never going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And so we tend to do that a lot in life. We set these expectations that are completely unrealistic. And so one of the things that martial arts taught me is that you have to kind of chunk your goals into smaller components and work on the things that you know you can achieve success in before you move to the next level. It would be like you coming into the gym and saying to me, hey, Rodney, who's the best guy you have in the gym? I want to spar that guy. I want to fight that guy. Well, if you've never trained before and you have no experience, how long are you going to last? A couple of seconds, and you'll never come back again. And that's how a lot of people tend to do that, though, which is always interesting to me, is that they want to achieve success, but it's like they want to be just one step before success happens, not realizing that there are a lot of things that go into becoming successful. And so when we read about these successful people, especially entrepreneurs, we're hearing about all their successes. But oftentimes what never gets written about is what they had to do in order to become successful. And what you will find is they had many, many failures, a lot of setbacks. And it was their ability to bounce back from those setbacks, come back from the failures, rather than seeing it as a failure, seeing it as an opportunity to learn. So the way that they frame situations are different. Mm-hmm. That's what makes them successful.
And also the ability to weather the failures, because we know that there's no success without failing. It's just impossible. And so the way you overcome it and learn from it is what makes you successful and make your next project a reality.
Agreed. But but the problem is a lot of us, especially in the Western world, are fighting an educational system that doesn't allow for failure. I mean, we have all these tests, and if like, for example, if a kid comes home with their report card, and let's say they have a whole bunch of A's, but somewhere mixed in there is one F. Most parents don't focus on the A's, they focus on the F. They focus on the thing their kid's failing at, not realizing that, in actual fact, when that child grows up, what's going to enable them to achieve success is not that they worked on, quote-unquote, the things they're not good at, but rather that they worked from their strengths. And so so that's another thing that martial arts teaches you, to work from your strengths, not from your quote-unquote weaknesses.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned the school system, and I look at my son. I think here in the U.S. especially, the focus is, you have to, ace the test. The test it's all about the test. And I always tell him, listen, whether you get a good mark or a bad mark, as long as you try it, as long as you learn something, that's really the key here. I mean, we don't really care about the marks. I mean, as parents, we shouldn't really, but the teachers really make it very difficult for kids to go through the system. That's why, again, martial arts and the system and the state of mind of thinking about what have you learned from failure is really key. And also in business, right?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the Zen mind, which is the second principle, and you're talking about the warrior body and the Zen mind.
Yeah. So there we're talking about a few different things. Typically, what I go to next, once people understand that perfection is an illusion, is understanding that the way that you think and feel really matter. And they matter oftentimes more than just the way that you think. But one of the things that tends to happen a lot of times is people get themselves into trouble because they spend so much of their life either in the future or the past. Now, there's a time for that. Of course, you need to think about the future and set goals. You need to reflect on the past so you don't keep making the same mistakes. But when you actually have to perform, when you have to bring your best to bear, your best game, the only place that ever happens is in the moment. And where most people trip themselves up is that they're trying to be in their best game in the moment, but they're actually not in the moment. They're either in the future or in the past. And so one of the things that I teach my students and my clients there is kind of reflecting and being aware of how much of their time is actually spent either in the future and the past. And anybody listening to this, if they just took a day out and said, today I'm just going to be self-aware and see how much of my time is spent thinking about the future and the past, I think they'd be quite surprised that so much of our time is obsessed with that. And so we miss so much of the nuances of life and what's really important and often what's really in front of us, because we're living in those two places. And so that next step is about grounded thinking. In a way, it's about using the thinking mind to cheat the thinking mind to get yourself back to the present moment so that you can have more of the fullness of experience of life as it's unfolding.
And it's interesting because it's so hard to focus in the moment, because we always do stuff because we think about what's going to happen tomorrow. Why am I working hard now? Because I want to save. What is one trick that you can share with us that we can use to actually practice more being in the moment?
Well, there's this idea that's very prevalent at the moment, which is mindfulness, and I'm sure you've heard of it as well.
Of course.
It's kind of like the buzzword, right? But I think it's more than just a buzzword, because one of the things that really set me on the path of understanding mindfulness is actually through martial arts, because I know that you've trained martial arts before, and so you would be aware of this, is that anytime you're in some kind of sparring environment where you're dealing with somebody who's trying to hit you and you're trying to hit them, right. If you start kind of thinking about what they're going to do next, or you're worried about the mistakes that you just made, what you tend to do is get yourself into trouble. Because even though you might be in the future or the past, the person in front of you is not going to stop hitting you in the face, right? So right. That's just the reality. So one of the things that I teach my clients is the idea of being mindful, but a little bit different, because what I want them to do is be mindful in action. Rather than sitting, which I think is a valuable tool, but rather than sitting on a zafu or a cushion and meditating in a nice quiet room with candles and so forth, that's sure. Fine. But you still have to take that embodiment of that mindful experience into your everyday life, in the chaos of life. And oftentimes people find that very difficult. So one of the strategies and tactics that I teach people when they're actually in a martial art environment is to focus on their breath. And specifically what I want them to do is focus on their out-breath. And what you find is that when you're focusing on your breath, you tether yourself to the present moment. I mean, I can give you an example of that, and you can do it right now. Or anybody listening to this, if they want to do it afterwards, they can. But one of the things that what I often tell my clients is, I want you to breathe out really hard, but make sure that you can hear it. And while you're breathing out, so while you're exhaling, try to think at the same time. So give it a go. See if you can do that. Yeah. So what most people will find is that when they're breathing out, obviously they're aware that they're breathing out, but to have a thought at the same time is virtually impossible. So what that teaches you is that by being aware of your breath and bringing your attention to your breath, specifically your out breath, and there's another reason for that we can talk about, but by specifically focusing on the out breath, what you do is you tether yourself to the present moment.
Because you're actually forced to think about the breath.
You're forced to think about it. You're kind of tricking your thinking mind into another way of thinking, but you're actually making it become more present. So that's the trick there. That's one kind of example of how it can be applied. The other part of it is that oftentimes when people are in a highly charged situation or when they have to perform, naturally they get stressed out. Their fight and flight system kicks off. You feel the adrenaline, the butterflies, and those kinds of things going off. What that is your autonomic nervous system doing its job, which is designed to do, and your sympathetic nervous system kicks off, which is that part that gets you ready for a fight. Even if it's not a real fight, just the idea of, for example, somebody having to stand on a stage and speak to a group of people they don't know, that to the body feels like the same feeling as 10,000 years ago running away from a lion in the savannah. So when you focus on your out-breath, what you do is you invoke the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite side to this, which is the side that brings you back to homeostasis, which brings you back down to a state of calmness. Now, the whole idea of the autonomic nervous system is that it's automatic. You don't have any conscious control over it. So you've probably had this experience where, you feel kind of anxious and hyped up, and you're telling yourself in your mind, you're saying, calm down, relax, but it's not making any difference. And the reason it's not making any difference is because you're trying to talk to the autonomic nervous system that's automatic and doesn't listen to your conscious mind in that way. The only way that you can actually engage with the autonomic nervous system is through breathing, specifically the out-breath. So when you focus the out-breath, it actually engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that side of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, that's designed to bring you back to homeostasis and to calm you down. So you can actually invoke that in a highly stressful situation, which is kind of cool. And nobody will even know that you're doing it. I mean, you don't need to breathe out that everybody can hear it. You just have to focus on the out-breath. So now you're doing two things. Yeah. You're bringing yourself back to the present moment, which is always a good place to be if you want to perform. It also makes you a lot more aware of what's going on around you, so you're in that present moment. But then second to that is you engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, which is calming you down as well.
Excellent. I think it's a great tip. I don't think that I was aware of the outer breath. I was always doing it the other way. Again, breathing was always helpful, and I'm going to try it. And hopefully people who listen to it should give it a try as well.
Sure.
So let's talk about the body attitude and how it matters. And this is the third principle. What is interesting about this, Rodney, is that I had on the show a couple of body language experts over the past year or so, and everybody has different tips about the importance of how we carry ourselves, body-wise. So I'm curious to hear about your this principle as well.
Yeah. So my tagline for that is, how you show up matters more than you think. And it's really true, because in a martial arts setting, and again, you would know this, if you're holding yourself in a certain way when you're dealing with an opponent, and you're holding yourself in a confident structure, confident fighting stance, you feel like you can really take this on. But if you're not confident in your fighting stance, maybe you're a little bit too loose, too open, you feel vulnerable. You feel like you can get hit. And that has a knock-off effect. It's not just the physiological experience of that, but it also affects the way that you think. So we now know that through research that the way that you hold your body changes your physiology, which changes the chemicals in your brain, which then changes the way that you think and feel about yourself in a very real, concrete way. And in actual fact, there's a really great talk about this on TED Talks, where Professor Amy Cuddy talks about her research into working with MBA students to get them to put themselves in what she calls power poses. And what she found is that the way that you position your body, the way that you hold your body, is either going to empower you or disempower you. So although I think the body language is very important, I think the subtle difference here that I'm talking about is more than just body language as in what people see, which obviously is important. How you hold your body changes your physiology, which changes the way that you think and feel about yourself ultimately. So that's very important because, for example, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you're pitching an idea to a group of investors, you know what you need to say, you've rehearsed this, but the way that you're holding your body is saying a completely different thing to them, but also the way that you're holding your body could affect the outcome of how you talk to these investors. Because if you're not holding your body in a confident way, what you say is not going to be confident, and there's a very strong likelihood that you're going to trip yourself up in the process. Because oftentimes there's a feedback loop that happens, and we were talking about, being in the past or the future, and suddenly you find yourself projecting into the future or holding on to the past in this conversation, where really you should be in that moment present, completely there, because that's where you can give your best performance. And most people who have done any kind of, when they've ever had to do talks and speeches, public speaking, will say that the minute they find themselves moving into the future or the past is the minute they get themselves into trouble. And that's normally where they find it very difficult to come back from. So just by changing, even at that moment in time, let's say you kind of projecting into the future or the past, just by how you hold your body, if you change the way that you hold your body, that will affect the way that you think and feel about that situation, and it will get you back on track. So mind and body are always working in tandem. It's not one or the other. For a very long time, we've had this Cartesian dualism, where this attitude is, if you're not thinking it, then it's not real. The rational intelligence. But there's also the body intelligence. So to say that you are embodied means to understand that mind and body are actually one. The way that I hold my body affects my thinking mind. How I think affects my body. If I can get those two to work together and rather, not fight against each other, then I'm going to find myself in a much better position to take on the chaos of life.
And I think people who understand, the body language effectively are definitely much more successful and are able to influence others in just the way they walk into a room. Or sometimes I meet colleagues, being an attorney myself, and in the business of law, you can see somebody walks into the court or speaking to the judge or even into a negotiation. The first 3 minutes is all about body language, how they walk in, how they sit, how they look, and it's very powerful. I'm very happy that you mentioned that in your principles, because it kind of all works together.
Agreed.
It cannot be replaced.
And 70% of all communication is nonverbal.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's move on to and this is one of my favorites, the surfing the edges of chaos. And you said something about your son. It says like a boss, right?
Yeah, that's what he says. So there's really, it's kind of like almost bringing these ideas together that we've been talking about. We've already mentioned it, this idea of mindfulness in action. So you can kind of almost get a sense of, if you can get the way that you hold your body right and you can bring your thinking mind more to the present moment, then you are being more mindful. And really the key ingredients about being mindful is that you are in the present moment, you're aware of the present moment, you're taking everything in both internally and externally. But crucially, the main aspect of this is there's a non-judgment aspect to it. So you're not judging how you feel or how you think. Now, typically what most people do is they judge the way that they feel or think, and this typically creates a narrative, a story, and then it's that story that's either future or past-based. You don't have a story that's in the present moment. Stories are either something that's about to happen, or you think it's about to happen, or it's already happened, right? And so when you're in the present moment, there is no story. It just is what it is. It's happening right here, right now. And so being mindful in action is that ability to be present in that moment, regardless of what is happening, without any judgment. And I can give you an example of that. It's kind of interesting to me as a martial artist, there's some days, just like anybody, I don't want to go down. I don't want to train. I don't feel like it. You wake up, you're feeling stiff, you're feeling sore. You just don't want to go down, right? But, somehow you manage to get yourself up and you go down and you have the most amazing experience. Then there's other days where you are pumped and amped and all you want to do is get to training. You've got all these plans in your head. You get down, you have the worst experience. Traditionally, that doesn't make sense because, the conventional wisdom suggests that if I'm feeling pumped and amped, I should have a great session. And if I don't feel like it, I should have a horrible session. So what's really going on? Well, on the days that I didn't feel like it, the one thing that was missing was an expectation. I didn't have an expectation. I just went down and I put myself on the mat and I let myself loose and I had the fullness of the experience, no expectation. Whatever happens, happens, right? And without even realizing it, I was being mindful in action. So what that tells you is even though that you may be thinking or feeling a certain way, doesn't have to define the outcome of an experience. And this was probably the most powerful lesson I ever learned in martial arts. Just because I don't feel ready for this doesn't mean that I can't do it and do it well and potentially come out the other side a victor and win. And that flies in the face of conventional wisdom.
And I think it's interesting. The reason why I like this part is because normally when we're in business or when we try to engage with family members, we always have expectations. We want to have the party to be perfect. We want to have the meeting to be just like we think about it. We want to do this, and the expectation makes our life anxious. I mean, people in the U.S. are very, very anxious, and I'm sure it's the same in other parts of the world. And the reason is because our expectations are just too high and unrealistic. And it's our fault. We make it like that. You know what I mean? And so I think if you put yourself into a say, you know what, I'm just going to do it no matter what happens. I'm just going to enjoy it, or I'm going to do my best, or whatever works for you. You'll be surprised at what's going to happen. And that's what I really like about this, because it's one of the things about martial arts that they won't let people make assumptions. They'll make you try, and whatever happens, happens. You have to do your best.
I agree, and in the Western world, there's a expectation that you should have an expectation in order to do something. It's kind of a weird way of being, right, and seeing things. You were talking early on about you have children as well, and so do I. And what most children will tell you, especially as a parent, what they most want from you is they want your attention. They want you to be with them fully. Not distracted. And there's this idea of being mindful in your communication. And how many of us as parents are always thinking about something else when we really should be completely with the person that means the most to us, that we love more than anybody else in the world. And so, again, the expectation itself takes us away from the fullness of our experiences. I've seen people, I travel around the world, and I've seen people get up like early, crazy in the morning to go watch a sunset. And they're watching the sunset, but they're on their mobile phone. It kind of defeats the purpose, right? So you're there to have the fullness of this experience, but you're actually not there.
And it happens all the time. People will travel. I mean, we have some beautiful places here in the U.S., the Grand Canyon, or, you always see people who are, on their phones or when they're doing whatever, and they're turning their back to the view. It's just amazing.
It is.
You drove all the way to the Grand Canyon, and you're on your phone, you're back to the view, and it's just an example of how we don't, life passes and we don't appreciate the little things.
Exactly.
So, the last two principles, exhale and rolling with life punches, this can apply to anything. And I know it comes from martial arts, but why don't you kind of share with us a little bit about those two last principles and how you use them in your daily life and how we can use them?
Well, I've actually already mentioned it. This idea of exhale is that breath, as a martial artist, breath enlivens movement, right? If I told somebody to go onto the mat and they had to hit the pads or spar for, say, 2 minutes, and I said to them, okay, the whole time you're doing this, I want you not to breathe. Well, you're not going to make it very far. And what you start to realize is that breath enlivens your movement. Without breath, there's no life. But we spend so little of our time, just as you were saying earlier, you could be at the Grand Canyon and be on your phone, but we spend so little time actually connected to ourselves. Most of our time is connected to something else, be it the mobile phone or our internet or whatever that may be, the social media. I think there is an important thing, and it's healthy for humans to take time out and just to spend some time with yourself, just focusing on your breath, something that you just take for granted. You don't even give it a second thought. And by doing that, as we mentioned earlier, when you're focusing on that out breath specifically, you are bringing yourself into a calm state, but you're also tethering yourself to the present moment. And so it's an opportunity to breathe and be mindful and be more present in your life, even if you can just take 10 minutes out of the day. It was kind of interesting because I have one of my clients who is an entrepreneur, and, as it is when you're an entrepreneur and you have people that work for you, there's a lot of stress. And he said, you know what, Rodney, what I did the other day, I took your advice. I went into my office, I locked the door, I sat in my office chair, just unplugged from everything. I focused on my breath for 5 to 6 minutes, and the rest of the day just felt a whole lot better.
Right.
We don't do that. We don't take time out for ourselves. This is the thing as well. I see people, they say, well, I am taking time out for myself. I go to the gym. And I'm like, yeah, but you're running on the treadmill and you're watching CNN.
Exactly.
You're not taking time out for yourself. Go and walk out in nature. Go to a park. Go somewhere where you can just leave everything in the car and just be with yourself and just be mindful even as you walk and focus on your breath. And I think that comes into that final idea of being resilient. What is it to be resilient, right? Resilient basically means is your ability to bounce back from setbacks.
Right.
And how are you going to... Yeah, exactly what you need. But how are you going to bounce back from setbacks if you're not doing all this stuff that I've been talking about? That's what I experienced in my life, is that without these embodied principles and making them a ritual every single day, it becomes very difficult to bounce back from these setbacks. I will say this, and there's something that I've often said in other interviews, is that one of the lessons that became very profound for me was that it's very important to focus on the mundane, the things that we take for granted. Most people, when they're focusing on things, it tends to be the big things, and that's where they want to get things right. I kind of hinted to that earlier on. But what I found is that if you can't get the small things right, the things that you take for granted, in my experience, taking on the big things is virtually impossible. So that could be if you're the kind of person that every morning on your drive to work, you fly off the handle and go into road rage. If you can't handle that, that's something you do every day. It's part of your routine, and you can't keep your emotions, under wraps and managed better. How are you going to deal when there's a big crisis at work?
Right.
So I think people should spend time actually just working on those mundane things. Washing the dishes. Washing the dishes is the most mundane thing that people have to do, unless, of course, they're lazy and they put it in one of those front-loaded dishwashers, right? But if you're doing it manually, the old school way, it can be a very meditative experience where you can spend 10 to 15 to 20 minutes washing dishes, focused on your breath, be completely present. And those are the experience that I found that ultimately build up to building your resilience. Because people ask me, well, how do I get more resilient? get more resilient in the small things that really trigger you, that make you crazy. Get those right.
For example, I'll fold the laundry from time to time, and that's 15, 20 minutes, and that's just like that. Just all you do is focus on that, right? And I can think about it.
Yeah.
That great example. So we can take this, do the dishes manually, fold the laundry. It's you'll be surprised at the benefits of doing that, right?
Well, there's a famous book. It's After the Ecstasy, There's the Laundry. I think that's the title. But basically, that's the premise, right? You can go down and you can do like a meditation retreat, which I think is great, and be in silence for 10 days.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. But the reality is, after the 10 days, where do you find yourself? You're back in the midst of chaos. I would rather find more proactive ways to deal and be more mindful in action in the midst of life's chaos and get it right there than escape to a 10-day retreat and be silent for 10 days, only to find myself back in the martial arts of everyday life and still not able to handle the little things that trigger me. Get those right first, and I think you find that this idea of being more mindful in your life really then has a substantial meaning.
Absolutely. And, find those little things that you do every day, and that's going to be a little escape, as opposed to just, getting away for, like you said, a retreat or like a Tony Robbins 3-day event, and you come back and you're like, what am I going to do now? Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. So, Rodney, if listeners want to get your book, what is the best way? I'm going to put links in the show notes. But is there an Amazon link, or where do we find the book?
Probably the easiest place to go is to the site, fullcontactliving.org. So it's fullcontactliving.org. On the site is the links to the book if they want to buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so forth. There's also the audiobook. So there's an audio version now that you can purchase. And there's also a free complimentary video course where I go into these 6 principles we just, kind of breeze through, but in more depth. And it's free, so you can sign up and go through the 6-day course and learn a little bit more about these principles and how to embody them in your life.
Perfect. And we'll make sure to have links to all the things you just mentioned in the show notes, so people can see it, can link and download and get the book. And I'm definitely excited to start implementing some of the things we talked about. Rodney, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time. If somebody wants to contact you, what's the best way to reach you personally?
Rodney at coachrodneyking.com.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Rodney. I wish you a beautiful, it's almost the end of the week, so hopefully you have a nice weekend over there. And thanks for joining us and our listeners. And thank you, our listeners, for joining in us every week, tuning in, your emails, your questions. We'll continue to bring inspiring guests. I look forward to getting feedback on this show and other episodes, and we'll see you on our next episode. Have a beautiful weekend.